Jonathan Fink actually hosted. I'm doing a technical platforming here, but Jonathan, this is really his thing. But welcome to another live chat that we're having daily, and I'll let Jonathan do the rest of the introductions while I drink from my Russian warship go fuck yourself mug.
So this is my fifth one this week, and it's not something we've done much on the channel before. I have to say I massively enjoy them, and because it's in a good cause, we are raising money to get trucks to the front. These are essential pieces of kit at this time, especially when Ukraine is being incrementally pushed back on a variety of fronts. It's not the absolute calamity that you could perhaps read about in some of the less thoughtful corners of the mainstream media. Nonetheless, these pieces of equipment are incredibly important, not just for Ukraine's war effort, but to saving lives. We'll come to that a bit later in the episode, because we've got some extraordinary images of the very trucks that we're fundraising, that were fundraised by the organization that we're working with, and we'll be able to show you how they literally save people's lives on the front, which is incredibly important. Russia doesn't care about the lives of its soldiers. It doesn't care about its own competence. It doesn't care about those people it's fighting or its lives of its allies. Ukraine does. Here's the image that Jonathan's brought up. So these vehicles are obviously made ready for difficult conditions, but metal plates are placed within the cavities of the door and in the front, so that people's limbs are protected. In this instance, it was an intense drone strike that was targeted at these vehicles. These are the very type that we're fundraising for. And as I say, these were fitted out by the charity that we have all aligned with. All the soldiers survived with minor injuries in these. If they hadn't been fortified and armored, then I just dread to think what kind of injuries would have been sustained. So this is fresh. I think this only happened in the last day or so. This is absolute evidence of the importance of what we're doing here, and the splendid work that's been done in Lviv to fit these vehicles out to cope with the conditions at the front, but also to protect and save the most precious thing to Ukrainians, which is the lives of their people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really kind of, on the one hand, yeah, I say it's great to see. It's not great to see vehicles that have been hit by shrapnel, but it's great to see that the vehicles are being used, and B, that the work that these guys do on the vehicles once we get them to Ukraine has a real validity to it, and it, you know, as you say, saves lives. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, and one of the great things about doing this is that the survivability of Ukrainian soldiers is paramount to Ukraine, winning this war, because Russia, and with its mentality, but also with its resources of millions and millions of men, they don't care. As Jonathan pointed out, Ukrainians care, not only out of a sheer desire to see their fellow soldiers survive, but also because they're a quantitative asset for Ukraine to win this war. They'll keep them alive so that they can live to fight another day. And so there's also a practical reason, if you're looking at it very starkly. Veteran soldiers who have been in combat are more capable. So let's keep those soldiers alive and at work doing what they're doing. Hopefully, ultimately, with the result in being in peace. But until that time, let's get some guys out there who've been through it and can give that experience to others, and also conduct themselves in a more experienced way. So all around, great. Let's get more of them in.
Yeah, and we're almost at halfway, aren't we, Jonathan and Phil? So this is 72,000 of 150,000, and we haven't started too long ago, so I think that's pretty impressive. So here is where everyone's at. Fantastic news for 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 the Ukrainian soldiers that's 7 vehicles already funded in total. As someone said, who was it? Yeah, David L here. Who to donate for trucks? ATP, Silicon Curtain, Phil Ittner. So Phil is in need of some assistance there. He's not done as much content on YouTube as some prolific YouTubers like myself and Jonathan, who just spend their lives banging on endlessly, in a good way. But yeah, so please donate to any and all of those who are featuring here. And today that's obviously Philip Ittner, Silicon Curtain, and ATP Geopolitics as well. So really proud of all of you guys.
We had a question yesterday, which was like, who should we give to? Does it matter? What's going to happen if one person's raised more, one person's less? And we've got a bit of rivalry here, a bit of competition, just helps get the audience riled up. But ultimately, all goes into the same pot. We've got an overall target, which is 150,000. Yep. We want to smash that. We want to get at least 15 trucks, potentially more. I know some people talked about, look, can we really push it, get 25? This makes such a tremendous difference. Just think, each of those vehicles contains 3 Ukrainian service people. They are fathers, brothers, sons. They have their own networks of family. And one of those vehicles, 10,000 euros, has saved 3 lives, plus has protected, a huge network of loved ones and friends from the worst possible outcomes. So this is incredibly important stuff.
Absolutely. Let's boost this beauty. Let people know, as Benny Pie says, Ukraine is the winner. I was wondering, Jonathan and Phil, if I can, is it okay to call you Phil, or Phil? Is it Philip?
Yeah, Phil's fine.
Phil, cool. I was wondering if I can just lead on from a discussion we were having yesterday. I found yesterday's discussion fascinating, Jonathan, when we were speaking with regard to disinformation with Andrew Mercado from Mercado Media. And it was a wide-ranging discussion about the psychology of beliefs, about sort of knowledge, about questioning ourselves, questioning the information we get. And I came across this today. I think, Jonathan, you've seen this as well. This absolutely freaks me out. And I do find this rather disturbing, but it's in that same vein of disinformation that we were talking about yesterday. So this could be a good starter for today. I know it's the same topic. Now, can you let me know if you can hear this when I play it? So Elliot Higgins says, and he's from Bellingcat. Bellingcat, the open source investigative, that word, a bunch of people who do an awesome service for Ukraine and actually around the world, other like Syria and chemical weapons and all sorts of stuff. Russia hates Bellingcat and Russia hates Elliot Higgins, but looks like Russia's ongoing disinformation campaign has changed up tactics and is now finding students talking online and deep faking their voices so they can use them to put out their own anti-Western messages. The blow is taken from this original. So listen to this. Can you let me know if you can hear this? Put your thumbs up.
The climate crisis is a health crisis, and people around the world are facing escalating and compounding impacts on their physical and mental health because of the impacts of climate change. And action really has been growing on the climate and health intersection, which is really welcome to see, but this action is still lagging behind need, especially for mental health. But there are...
Okay, so that gives you a sense of her voice, and what you have here is a full, I think, 47 seconds of her head speaking, right? And then you get this. So this is then the deep fake, which starts with her and then uses her voice to then go off on one and attack Ukraine and the EU. And I find this insidious and thoroughly disturbing. So give this a listen.
The climate crisis is a health crisis, and people around the world are facing escalating and compounding impacts on their physical and mental health because of the impacts of climate change. Climate is important, but there are more serious problems that threaten our security. These are the leaders of European countries. They allowed the European military to help Ukraine point its weapons deep into Russian territory. This is insane when you think about the weapons Russia has at its disposal and what the consequences could be for our planet. I call on environmentalists around the world to unite to influence politicians in Europe. Let's save the world from destruction and start saving the climate together with Russia.
It's just horrific that Russia's going to be saving the climate, right? But the quality of the voice manipulation there is insanely good. Now you can tell because we know that there was a cut there and it went to the different visuals. But if I didn't prep you with that, you wouldn't have thought twice about that at all. Now there are some other examples that Bellingcat, Elliot Higgins has here, where he said they slightly struggle with the accent in this one, but other ones as well, and they are just. It's just horrendous. But then he goes on to say pretty obvious bot activity is boosting these posts, and it looks like Russian disinformation is moving on to Blue Sky. So a lot of us are on Blue Sky as a reaction against Twitter and Twitter being manipulated by Russia particularly. Now here it says, which I guess is another sign of Blue Sky's success. However, here you can see all of these kind of fake accounts with very similar names. You know, Souza, Silver, Santos, you know, really similar, who are liking, all of these people are liking those posts, disinformation posts, and boosting them, etc., etc. So we are seeing almost in real time a Russian disinformation campaign start and then come to fruition and be spread around Blue Sky, and it's absolutely incredible, and I think thoroughly worrying, which is why yesterday we were talking about this is the biggest threat for the next 10 years, I think, outside of like physical wars, like it's the information wars that are happening inside our heads and in our countries and with our electoral systems. I just thought I'd play that because I thought it was fascinating yet scary, and see what you guys think.
Well, I'll have a quick jump in there, because coming from a sort of tech background and marketing background, the data has existed, or the early incarnations of data has already existed for more than a decade, that tries to really get inside your head and understand, you know, what you buy, when you buy it, how you buy, and all the different sort of, you know, influences, to the point where they've got quite a high degree of predictive power. This stuff has actually existed for quite a long time, and they'll target ads at you just at the right moment to increase your propensity to buy. Now, this obviously is in the service of capitalism. It's pernicious, but it's not, you know, it's not pure evil. But this same technology, of course, is now on steroids with AI, and potentially the amount of computing power is going to be inordinately more when we have, you know, functioning quantum processors as well. So this stuff is not just going to go away. You know, it's not going to go away, and it's not even going to expand incrementally. It's going to be an exponential increase in volume and quality of this stuff. But also they're going to be able to not just sort of spew it out there into the environment to see what sticks and what doesn't. They will be able to tweak these videos based on your prior responses, based on an understanding of what triggers you. So this isn't just going to be like, here's a deep fake, let's see what works. There will be a deep fake for everybody, and there'll be a version of that for everybody. They'll be able to change, you know, the ethnicity, the voice, the age, even tweak aspects of appearance, and they're going to tweak the script, the narrative, and they're going to personalize it for you individually at that point on a Tuesday afternoon, when they know you have perhaps a little bit more vulnerability than you would on a Friday afternoon, whatever. The amount of data and insight is going to be insane, and the ability to manipulate it. So I think we need to stop sort of maybe looking at the qualitative factor and actually look at the geopolitics of it. Is Russia suddenly going to stop doing this stuff if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine? No, it's not. Is, you know, like we said yesterday, the gun's going to fall silent at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, you know, 11th, like in First World War. No, if anything, the shift of their resources and aggression is going to pile into the information sphere if they are forced to, you know, stop firing the guns at the current scale that they're doing. I don't actually even believe they will observe a ceasefire fully. We may well go back to the situation we saw with Minsk and various provocations, lies, and aggression on a lower scale. But this information stuff, we're just, you know, we're standing on the beach looking at this tsunami somewhere on the horizon. We are so not ready for it.
Well, Putin himself, what was it, 4 years ago, I want to say, in one of his, you know, press, which of course he's now just recently done, but one of those he did, I want to say it was about 4 or 5 years ago, where he said, whoever takes the lead in AI will take the lead strategically. So he looks at it as a weapon. He is looking at AI and the benefit of AI as a weapon. Because of course, again, realizing that there's no way that he can take on the might of, the American military, much less, the entire combined NATO alliance. We're gonna take you without firing a shot. We're gonna get inside your brains. We're gonna get inside your head, and they are very, very good at it. So yeah, this isn't just going to stop when the shooting stops. This is gonna go on for a long time because the Kremlin recognizes that by manipulating our perception of so much, not just in terms of like international relations, but like our perception of reality. That by destabilizing our populations, by using freedom of speech in particular against ourselves, that you can undermine societies entirely without a kinetic weapon. So it's scary. Yeah. No, I think we're all in agreement here that this is something we really have to take seriously, and there's no clear answer to it because, again, it is one of our building blocks of a democracy is freedom of speech. But when speech and reality can be twisted to the will of an autocratic system which wants to do nothing but destabilize us, how do we keep our rights, our freedom of speech, and at the same time defend ourselves?
Yeah, we talked
Big
a lot
question.
about this yesterday, Phil, and there was a lot of talk of what I was suggesting that the only way you can do that is regulation. That should be allowed to happen in this domain because we defend our country and our national interest from a conventional invasion. We defend it from a cyber invasion in terms of putting up cybersecurity. What are we doing in terms of informational defense, if you like? And I think Ronnie Vranken here has it right, which is our activists are not funded by a crooked government, sadly. So when you look at how much money Russia is funding its disinformation projects with, the question is, are we doing the same to defend against disinformation? What is there an asymmetry there that has Russia have the huge advantage in the information spaces? We are losing the war, the information war, partly because, as you say, we're not prepared, and we're not prepared because we haven't yet taken it seriously enough and pumped in enough money, time, and resources.
I would agree 100%. But in addition to that, as coming from my perspective as a veteran of broadcast news, we also have a responsibility to our populations to educate them better on how to consume information. We teach our children how to read. We should teach our children also how to consume, visual and audio and kind of the screens basically, which are so everywhere in our lives now. We need to educate our populations about how to consume information and how to do it better. Yes, the Finns have been very good about this. The Estonians have been very good about this. But we need to adapt this in a much wider aspect of all of our Western civilizations, because our children, it will start from our children, who will have tablets from already do, but screens are everywhere, and consuming information this way is how we all now less and less people read, and more they get information from screens. So we need to teach our children how to consume electronic information just as much as we teach them how to read a book.
I have twin boys, 14-year-olds boys. One of them is particularly susceptible, I think, to just because he's more interested in that stuff. But he's like started Andrew Tate like mentioning things by him, and like, oh, hang on, big alarms here. What are you looking at TikTok? And the algorithm is just throwing him. And we talked about this yesterday. I should have brought this up as an example that he is being thrust without his like sovereignty. We talk about freedom of speech and freedom to hear these things, but actually he's not decided to listen to this stuff. He's been sent down that pathway by the TikTok algorithm, and then he doesn't have the skills to be able to differentiate plausible from implausible, right from wrong, possible from impossible, and and the moral quagmire that are those kind of topics. And it's like, oh my goodness, mate, we need to have a big conversation here. And you're right, the education has a really big role to play.
And there's another aspect to it.
Freedom from
manipulation.
I was going to say freedom from manipulation. I mean, people talk about freedoms often in absolute terms, but I think don't understand the distinction between freedom, privilege, and responsibility. Where's the freedom to not be manipulated by people with malign and selfish interests?
Indeed.
That's a really similar. Right, I don't want to go down this route because this is totally divisive. I know, because when I used to write on a previous blog, Pathos, which is all about inter-religious and non-religious conversation between like different groups, and it was like you trying to harbor these good relationships, but also really robust discussions. The ones that were the most divisive discussions I ever had is when I wrote articles on the Second Amendment and gun rights. My goodness, there were thousands of comments of people going absolutely nuts. Right. But that's a really similar thing, which is rights. People need to understand that rights don't exist. Like, there is this idea that and it's written into like the Constitution, Bill of Rights, that you have inalienable rights, but you don't. Like, there aren't. Rights do not. If all humans died, there wouldn't be like rights that existed in the ether, right? So we construct rights out of doing philosophy, and then we do the important thing of writing them into law by voting in people to then. So it's all to do with democracy, jurisprudence, philosophy, and then you need law enforcement to enforce the rights and the laws, right? So it's all much more complex than that, and it's much more constructed. But the point is, like Jonathan said,
well, spoken as a true Brit, but as a Yank, I'm going to have to push back on you a little bit on that.
Well, okay, we'll come to that. But my point was that your right to bear arms is no more relevant than my right to not have you bear arms. Do you know what I mean? Like, so whose rights win? And okay, your one's written on a piece of paper, but that's just a piece of paper written from a couple of hundred years ago. So it needs to be underwritten by rational thought and so on and so forth. And that's why we argue. And the reality is there aren't usually like inalienable truths to these that we can all agree on. Like, these are subjective to a large degree, and that's why we still argue about them. Certain countries will formalize them, but
I've got I take a very strong stance on this, because I actually think this is an inflection point between Russia and Western liberal democracies. But before I get off of that, I want to make one last point about consuming information and how we consume information. And again, pulling from my experience of working in broadcast television, there is also an aspect of understanding. We need to get people who consume televisual information to understand that the camera is an active participant in what you are seeing. People have this very bizarre thing when it comes to television or video or whatever it is, that they feel that they are looking through a window, that they are active, that they're a fly on the wall, and that this is a window into a reality that you are seeing. You are witnessing reality. You are not witnessing reality. You are witnessing reality captured by a device, controlled by a human being, who then determines how it's edited, how it's framed. So whenever I see stuff, videos that elicit, and this may not be so much about deepfakes, but rather about how your perception of reality in the world is manipulated. You're not there. Okay. There's a camera crew filming that, and they are deciding what to film and how to film it and how to then present it to you. So it is not reality. I use this analogy or this example, this story. I had a dear friend who married this lovely Irish girl, and she, along with her girlfriends, would gather occasionally for watching a show. They loved it was one of these things, The Bachelorette, or one of these kind of things. And they would gather around, and they would, of course, it was a participating thing, and they were, oh no, she should pick him, or he should pick her, or whatever it was. And I walked into the room, having just returned from Iraq, and I said to them, there was this particular intimate moment when there's heartfelt looking into one another's eyes, and I said, there's like 8 people standing around, filming this, right? I could not have gotten more venomous look from these women than had I told had I pulled down my trousers and done my business in front of them.
Yeah,
they are the casual observer of television or video or whatever, what have you. They don't recognize that it is, like all forms of communication, going through a process of, it goes from my brain, my device, all of that gets transferred into a piece of communication that I then transfer to you, and you, as the receiver of that information, interpret it totally independent of what it is that I am trying to present to you. And this is how truth can be manipulated. Maybe not, with the deep fakes, but not only with the deep fakes, but also with kind of videos showing X, Y, or Z on the battlefield. So we just have to be more knowledgeable and experienced on how to consume information, and especially as information is thrown at us so much more rapidly than our brains are built to kind of withstand. And also now, as Jonathan pointed out, with malicious intent to kind of get into your brain and define a reality that works in the benefit of somebody who doesn't have your best interest at heart. So that's the last thing I was talking about, disinformation. But as far as the question of inalienable rights,
fight.
Right.
Oh, here we go.
This is, I think, where we're going to have a wee bit of a difference of opinion, because I do think there is an inflection point between Russia and I don't want to give too much credit to Dugin, but this kind of Russian mentality that Dugin has brought to the fore, because it's not just him. And I don't know how much real influence. Yes, he's still taught at the Naval Academy and all that kind of stuff, but I don't know. But I think he's exemplary of this perception of what is rights in Russia, as opposed to the idea of inalienable rights in the Western democracies, and in particular America. The difference being that in the cornerstone of the American perception of quote unquote inalienable rights is that these are not given to you by the state. The state can regulate them, but these are God-given, or they're given to you by your creator, because you are not a chicken, you are not a cow, and you are not a goat. You are a human being, and by that distinction, you have certain rights given to you by something greater than the state. Again, the state is able to regulate it. The difference I see in Russia is that you are not born with rights. You are born like any other beast of burden, any other kind of animal. And if you are to get rights, you must achieve them. You must obtain them by strength of will, or by stating your case or influence to the state. But ultimately, you're not born with rights. you are granted rights by an external force. And the basic cornerstone of Western democracy, especially American perception of it, is you are born with these rights. These are things that are granted to you because you are not a chicken, you are not a cow, you are a human being, and by that sheer distinction, you have rights. And Dugan openly stated this about 8 months ago. He came out with a whole tirade about how it is only the state that grants you rights. Grants you. Now, I accept the fact that the state can regulate your rights. If you commit a criminal act, you can be imprisoned. If you have freedom of speech, but you can't shout fire in a crowded theater is always the example that's given. But I think this is an inflection point, and I know upon which side of this line I lie, and that is, I'm a human being, and but because I am a human being, I have rights that are different than another piece of chattel.
And my argument, without wanting to derail this conversation completely, my argument would be that human beings construct that out of being able to communicate effectively and being able to do rational thought and philosophize. So what we do is we construct those rights, and then actually I would agree, if that's Dugin's point, I wouldn't want to agree with an ultra nationalist genocidal numbnut, but actually it is states that confer those rights because that's practically what happens. So, for example, in America, you have the right to bear arms, but in the UK, you do not have the right to bear arms. So it literally is like it's kind of trivially true that is the case. So I do not have the right to go out in the street with a gun in my hand. I will get arrested for that. I don't have a license. I do not have the right to bear arms in the way I do in America. So that is conferred because of history and the way that some people got together and decided to do X, Y, and Z and wrote it down, and then it's enforced by law and by law keepers. And but my point is largely that that's constructed by humanity, and that will change in different places in different times. And what we generally do is we argue about what's good and right and proper, and then we write that into law, encyclopedias, and dictionaries. And when we all agree on that by consensus, then that should be a framework to which we should hold ourselves accountable. So when Russia is in the UN Security Council, it is like it is a signatory to this kind of like set of laws and appropriate behavior, and it's failed. It has. So, if we're going to use Russia, if we're going to bring this back to Russia and the idea of rights and the idea of responsibilities, Russia have not been acting responsibly. Russia have been doing things that are not aligned to the UN Charter of Human Rights, right, as we've set them out. And so what the frick are they doing on the Security Council? What the hell are they doing in the UN, actually? Because they just assumed that seat after the USSR broke down and dissolved, and they just went, oh, we're now having that seat that the USSR had. Well, why didn't Ukraine get that? So, I've done that on a live with Talaria before, which was, I think, really good. And I might be doing another chat with her about those kind of subjects. But, that would be where I take that. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, we can define those rights. We can shape those rights. We can put restrictions on those rights. But I mean, it's the very first. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And then, the big ones, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then you go from there and define things. So that, I think, we're a common ground with it. But what disturbs me about the Russian perspective of this is that and where I disagree with the philosophy, this kind of, I don't want to say nihilistic, but certainly kind of, the brutality that we see in Russia throughout its entire history, is that you are born no better than any other beast on this planet, and as such you can be grist for the mill, because it is the state that matters, not the individual, not the human being. Whereas the cornerstone of Western liberal democracy does say, well, no, we're not just any other kind of beast of burden, and that's where I
this is
differ.
where I think it's interesting, because the reverence for a piece of paper can ignore the fact that there are different interpretations of that paper, and actually the law itself, and lawyers, when I speak to lawyers, they just seem to have this sort of view: if it's on paper, it's eternal and untouchable. Whereas history shows that actually it's the interaction of law and culture. If you don't have, as Jonathan said there, a consensus that's built into a common culture of understanding of these things and stories we tell about why they're important, then that stuff on the paper can be open interpretation, and it can break down. So, we hold these things as being self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, for big chunks of American history, many people inhabiting that space were not held equal with others. And in fact, the idea of even equality within ethnicities is extraordinarily unbalanced. And it'd be interesting to explore this more, the sort of culture or philosophy of law interaction. But what strikes me about Russia, and I think this is the thing we're missing here, is we say, oh, Putin's just a bandit, he's not ideological, it's not like the Soviet Union, they're not trying to export a worldview. That's wrong.
I disagree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah. They see themselves as the world in the vanguard of authoritarianism. They see themselves as supporters of authoritarian formal power. So whereas states that have these kind of modes of operation don't see eye to eye on everything, and they don't collaborate on everything, there is a commonality, which is they want the world to be authoritarian. They want other modes of governance to be ineffective or even to disappear. In that sense, we are seeing an export of anti-Western values, a conscious effort to export what it sees as its mode of business, its business rules, to other parts of the world. And if we don't recognize that, then we're in real danger. I mean, I think they've corrupted many international bodies. The UN is practically useless. Russia, I think, has been trying to hollow that out for many, many years to render it ineffective and render the things you talked about, the post-war order, ineffective. They still want these institutions to exist, but they want it to exist in the way that the Duma exists. It's a hollow sham. It's a facade. It's something where you can go on pretending about normality and things aren't really as bad as they seem because you keep the sham institutions going. But it's a zombie political culture, and they are trying to turn the international framework of order into a zombie culture whereby they can pursue their own interests, irrespective, regardless of whatever we consider to be rights, responsibilities, law. They want a world where these things have no sway at all.
I if I can say, I don't know enough about Dugin, the detail of Dugin's thoughts, and I probably should do that. I probably should do some more reading into
him. Dear, be careful.
But I probably shouldn't. Yeah.
Oh, be careful. He's also a terrible writer. He's an awful writer. He's just boring.
Yeah. Well, if I'm right in understanding Phil in saying that, they believe in rights effectively being subjective and whatnot, which I would agree with, and like constructed by the state and therefore, not objective and out there, then that's an interesting contradiction that they have, or that Dugin has particularly, because what I do know from Russian thought is that they believe in what's called essentialism. I would describe it here. So essentialism is this kind of idea, almost like Plato's ideal forms, that you have these things have these essences. So you see this often in like discussions about gender. It's like men have these essences, and this is what it means to be a man, and you can't be outside of these kind of like this definition of what a man is. You can't be outside of what this definition of woman is, or whatever it might be. Whatever your thing you're talking about has an essence, right? And this is really interesting because this is what underwrites all of Russia's imperialism, which is that they have a sense that Russia has an essence, and Russia has these defined properties that include Ukraine, right? And so there's like an objective map of Russia that includes Ukraine. It is just Ukraine is an essential part, to use that term really quite philosophically, is an essential part of Russia. Now, that's very interesting because that's not what we're talking about in terms of the rights and abstract ideas over there, but they're applying this kind of objectiveness to abstract ideas over here. But it's patently false over here, because you can say, well, at what point in time are you taking that from? Like, are we talking about Russia? They just cherry picked a moment in history where the map suits them now and says that's what Russia is, rather than 100 years before that or 100 years after that. And of course, what about the people in Ukraine? Surely they get to define who they are. You don't get to dictate to this 40 million people that they are Russian and that the land that they live on and have lived on for generations is Russia. This is why the UK went around sticking flags in countries, and that kind of essentially, you're now part of the British Empire, and then eventually these countries went, actually, no, we're not, thank you very much, and you can sort off, and we've got our own flag, thank you very much, and we're going to have independence. And then we go, yeah, all right, actually, there's 1 billion of you and there's only 70 million of us, so yeah, that's probably fair enough. But because this essentialism is not a proper understanding of reality, that again, it goes back, actually is really similar to rights. Our understanding of what a country is agreed on by consensus. You will have maps that are written in China that will include certain parts of the globe that other mappers won't include in China. We can talk about Tibet, we can talk about parts of Russia, we can talk about the Kuril Islands, right? The reality of the world is it's all agreed on by consensus, and in order for us to agree on things by consensus, we need to get on well with each other and to sort out these kind of laws, sort out these international organizations that can enforce these laws, and that's all really complex, but that's the reality of it. And part of that isn't other people deciding what a set of people are, who they are and what country they belong to, but it's actually asking them what they, giving them agency. It's self-determination. So anyway,
which is a huge part of what this war is all about for the Ukrainians. I mean, there's a couple of other things I'd like to address as well. So Jonathan's 100% right in the sense that, like, we don't live up to these aspirations, and one of the greatest weapons that the Russians have is that they point at our liberal democracies and they go, look at you hypocrites. You tell us how to live our lives. You want us to adapt these kind of concepts that you in the decadent West live, but you yourselves do not live up to them. So they point the finger at, and sadly, unfortunately, because we don't live up to those high ideals, they find fertile ground for people to become disillusioned with the whole, say, Western liberal democracy project or the American project, for example, which is what they fixate on, and it degrades it. But it again goes back to my lovely and favorite Lincoln quote, which saved my life. For about a decade after I lived in Russia, I agonized over this. But that 1855 Lincoln quote to Jonathan Swift, a slave owner and a childhood friend of his, which basically says, if we ever go down the road of abandoning these ideals, then what's the alternative? And in 1855, he says, I'll go to Russia, where they don't even pretend to have, believe in liberty. And that is, again, why I think this war is so very important, and has, is, however this shakes down, this is a question that's going to, this kind of the ideological aspect of this war that concerns me the most, is that, okay, well, if yes, America or the liberal democracy lies and is a hypocrite and does not fulfill these high-minded ideals, well, what's the alternative that you're offering us, Russia? The answer is might makes right, and the way to obtain rights and freedoms and independence is only through aggression and force of will.
But
I'm deeply concerned by that.
Yeah.
John,
I was going to say this is the thing, because it's worse than many people realize. It's not that they don't want to play by Western rules and they want to create a new set of rules. It's that they don't want rules to apply anywhere. Rules are only
Mhm.
contingent on whether you can enforce them. You can only be a sovereign country if you're powerful enough to beat off a better armed aggressor. That is exactly
Everything's
the war.
binary.
Everything's binary, everything's contingent. No piece of paper counts, no treaty counts. There's no trust between states, between tyrants, between oligarchs, between individuals. There's no
It's all
communities.
performative.
There's nothing to bind people. It's simply a hierarchy of strength, the ultimate in pecking order.
Exactly. And so we kind of touched on this yesterday, Jonathan, but to the point that both of you were making, which is that if you're at the top of that hierarchy, and which Russia is, or every country is to a degree, that you know, we're talking about the country level of activity. If you decide not to adhere to those laws that we all have agreed upon by consensus, what happens? Like, I know if I do that in my country, if I decide not to adhere to the laws of this country, because I'm not at the top of the hierarchy, I get arrested and go to court and I get found guilty. Now, Trump does that and he gets away with it because he's at the top of that hierarchy in the US. But in terms of, that's kind of similar to like, okay, what's going on at the top of the hierarchy of the world? If Russia don't adhere to those norms and laws, what happens to them? And then, so this is where the UN comes in. This is why we need the UN, but the UN appears to be unable to deal with certain members of the international community that violate those laws and norms in outrageous manners, especially when one of those nations is sitting on kind of permanently on the UN Security Council and gets to veto anything that might disadvantage it, and there are no repercussions to the top of the ladder here, and that is a problem. I don't know what the answer is, other than like abstractly, we need a better UN.
Yes, we do, and it always drives me a little bit batty when the Russians will scream bloody murder on the global stage when they talk about like international law. They don't care about international law. They use that as a club to exert their will. If they cared about the concept of the rule of law, they best look internally first, because they don't care about the rule of law. Their legal code. And I've experienced it here in Ukraine, and I did also when I lived in Moscow, but more so here because I got burgled once. So I got immersed in the legal system here, and it's purposefully dense and Byzantine because it's meant to be contradictory. Because ultimately, it's not law; it's who has more power, and law is only a device for the powerful to exert their will against the less powerful. It's highly cynical, but I wonder.
Yeah, the more powerful
you guys,
are, the more you can utilize the law to your own.
It's not about. Have either of you guys
Also
seen?
power
There's a
as well.
wonderful Russian movie. There's a wonderful Russian movie called Leviathan from 2014. I don't know if either of you have seen it, but if you haven't, or members of the audience have not seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out. I am shocked, frankly, that Russia put this forward for an Academy Award, because it is a damning indictment of Putin's Russia, and it touches on these topics. That law is, in their world, law is not. It's, you know, our vision of law is, you know, she's wearing the blinders and she's got the balance and all the rest of it. That law is, you work within the law as a system. And that's what law is supposed to be, the rule of law. You remember when Vladimir Putin first came on the stage, he said, we're going to have the dictatorship of law. That was he literally said that when he was, when he was rising to power in the Kremlin, that what we're going to have is a dictatorship of law. It's not the concept of like law as a system that the rules of the game that we all play by. The laws are just another way of getting in the boxing ring and seeing, who's got the stronger punch. Anyhow, but check out 2014's Leviathan if you haven't seen it yet.
It's good stuff. I mean, that's the interesting difference. I mean, the Soviet Union, of which I'm not a big fan, as you probably can tell, nonetheless, there was more basis in law underpinning that society than there is in current Russia in 90s. And there's you've touched upon it there. It is strategic ambiguity. It's not just the system favors the powerful. And of course it does. Let's say in the Soviet Union, you will never go and see a dacha unless it's, Politburo. Even then, they built them to a certain specification. They're not huge compared to current ones. You would never see a dacha 2 stories high, because there was law saying, your dacha had to be these proportions. It could be no bigger. We're nominally all equal, right? So there were restrictions in points of law, which you can then see manifested in reality, in material reality. Okay, it's not perfect. You may completely disagree with those laws or even that framework, but there is a framework of law within, their own concept of it. Obviously, a lot of criminality. And when you have the black market, it's people explicitly breaking the law. Whereas what you have in the 90s is studied ambiguity, where you could simultaneously be running your business and conforming to a bunch of laws and breaking a bunch of laws. Now, why would you keep these on the statute book? Because as a rich person, you're going to carry on and do whatever you need to do. You're going to bribe the courts. So actually, this doesn't favor the rich necessarily. It's just not an impediment to their activity. It's because it creates a sort of mafia bond of criminality. It means that whatever activity you do, if you pop your head above the parapet, you are theoretically criminal in what you do by default. That only gets used if you show disloyalty to the power vertical. Then you can use the ambiguity enshrined in criminal law to take down your enemies. It's a tool of capricious autocrats and that kind of vertical system. That's why they kept it going.
Law really needs a functioning democracy. So, as Andy Resnick here says, law is an autocracy is just another club to use on people ruled by law, which is the way it's been most of history. Law is for the benefit of the big guy, not the peasant, which is a kind of fairly cynical look at things. And James Cottle here says, look at international sport. You see their governing bodies caving to autocratic money. They're a sign of what politics will be tomorrow. So this makes me think about like Russia is such an autocracy where such an oligarchy where the ultimate oligarch is Putin himself, like the richest man in the world. It's that power and the money. Then you look to other places, and I'm sorry to bring this up again, but I see the US at the moment going down the autocratic route because of the power of money and oligarchs. So you've got the single most powerful man in the world is now unelected in the middle of the White House, Elon Musk, making these decisions. Last night, if you don't know, he basically brought down a bill that Mike Johnson, the Speaker, was going to bring concerning the budget and keeping the government open. And Elon Musk sent out 70 tweets in one day and brought it down. And then Trump and JD Vance followed after Musk, and it's now fallen apart. And that's Musk, the most powerful man in the world, just with his tweets, has brought down an American law. You've got an oligarchy in America that I think is now becoming more and more obvious. And money and power, obviously, as we know from history, corrupts. And kleptocracy is a corrupt political system. That's what we're seeing in Russia, but I think we've seen that for a long time in America as well, and other countries. I'm not just singling out America, but when you have legalized lobbying, when you look at like the NRA paying 100% of Republican lawmakers, when you've got big pharma and insurance companies paying out all these people that are making decisions on the future healthcare of the country, then you have quid pro quo, and you have like a form of legalized corruption. I don't money. You need money out of politics. You need free and fair democracies, and that will allow laws to do their proper functioning. And you can change laws, but through the democratic process. And rant over.
Well, it accelerated. So, look, this has always been a problem in the United States, but it accelerated so quickly with the Citizens United decision, which made money a form of freedom of speech. So it's going to be hard to pull that back. I know that there are a lot of people in America, in particular, who are working very hard to make that happen. But it's going to be an uphill battle because, again, we have gotten to a place where the ultra rich, in the form of people like Musk or Thiel or Bezos, or the
Sachs,
robber barons of the day. Yeah, the robber barons of the day. It's we can only hope that we can pull it back as they did after the golden age, when all the robber barons were there. But if you look at American history, pulling back from the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the various oligarchs of the day was an extremely bloody. We forget how bloody that was in American history. I mean, all the union busting that went on in the early part of the 20th century. So how we get back to a place where we can get money out of politics in the West, because I agree with you, Jonathan. I think that's the only way that we ultimately also, by the way, defeat the autocracies of the world, is by functioning better to our higher ideals. And that is easier said than done. I mean,
yeah, because you can
if
talk
it was easy to do, we wouldn't have set up, these kind of parameters in the system, and we wouldn't need to, because we would be good, decent people who would let other good, decent people live the way they want to. Unfortunately, we have to kind of force people to be good sometimes.
Yeah, because getting money out of politics is not as simple as just like, it's not just cash, right? It's not that paying people cash and
It's
helping
the
out their
influence
campaign,
and
but it's influence. So Musk spends 44 billion on Twitter, and that influences an election, right? So that's money in politics, in my opinion, where he's bought a campaign tool, a platform to affect an election, and he's successfully done so. And so that is money in politics as well, but just in a different manifestation. Anyway.
Sure. Well, Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, did the same thing in many ways as well. So, look, it's constant gardening. This democracy stuff. It's not, it's heading towards another star, but we're never going to get there. But again, I go back to the question of, what do the autocracies offer in response? We may be hypocrites and failing at our ideals of the U.S. Constitution or the Magna Carta, or all the things that have built and brought us to our modern conception of liberal democracy, has failed, and as hypocritical and as often as we don't hit the mark and live up to it. What do the Russians offer in return? What's their alternative? Their alternative is brutality. Might makes right. You are the individual doesn't matter. The state matters. Look. These are not new questions. The American Revolution is still a project that is, not lost to us completely yet, but is definitely under intense pressure right now. And I don't think, it's the fact that autocracies, and particularly in Moscow, seem to be, pushing back against these ideals is a coincidence. I think we're we live in historic times, gentlemen, and
this is where I want
this is part of it.
I want to jump in with solutions. It's great to bring democracy index up and stuff, but people are very prone to despair, and propaganda, especially the nihilistic core behind Russian propaganda, really feeds on despair and people's sense of lack of agency. We need a tool to think about this stuff, because you can look at some of the things talked about, which is big money in sport. You can talk about big money in politics. This is a corruption of politics on a sliding scale. And we need to understand that the absolute absence of law is not the same thing as manipulated laws or corrupted laws or coerced laws. These are not good, but there is a difference. Russia likes that kind of moral and political relativism because it denies people agency or the sense of solution. But if we start to see it as a sliding scale, you can imagine that, okay, well, we've gone in the wrong direction, but you can pull it back. And you don't have to pull it back all at once or suddenly. You can pull it back in increments. You can improve certain things, even though you can't win the war all at once. And I think this is a helpful tool to get away from that pernicious Russian relativism, like, it's all lost, it's all over, it's all the same, there's no difference. There's every difference in the world, and we need tools to think and organize and trust our way out of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. You're right. I mean, you can get depressed. I look at the democratic backsliding in the world, and I think, here, democracy index from last year, it was an inauspicious year for democracy, with the average global score falling to its lowest level since the index began in 2006. Less than 8% of the world's population live in a full democracy, while almost 40% live under authoritarian rule, etc., etc. And then you look at, say, in the EU, which I think, and I know some people who don't like the EU will be spitting at the screen at this, but the EU is a paragon of democracy, as in you have to jump through hoops to get into the EU. The problem is they don't have anything to deal with people who then democratically backslide. So now you're looking at Slovakia and Hungary as being problematic nations who are democratically backsliding, and the EU is somewhat powerless to do anything about it, because it's like, really high levels to get in, but about maintaining that is slightly more difficult. So they can try and bribe you with funding, etc., etc. But it all gets a little bit controversial, especially when the information spaces are being controlled by Russia to set those populations against the EU. But the EU is actually, and it's going to sound controversial, I'm a big fan of the EU, even though we're not in it anymore, as a kind of like, they have these values of democracy where they're like, we've got some standards, and here are these standards, and you have to have transparency, and you have to, it's not the most perfect institution. Of course there's corruption, of course there are issues, but there are everywhere, right? But if you're talking about, like, where else in the rest of the world are you seeing, like, people that are trying to uphold democratic values in a really structural, formalized way? There's nowhere else in the world. There is nothing else like that. So that's why I'm hopeful of the EU, but that's why that's why Putin sees the EU as his biggest threat, right? That's why he hates it. You've got democracy existing. That's why he doesn't like Ukraine, or doesn't want Ukraine to exist in the way it does. It's because right over the fence of his people, they're looking over the fence, and the grass is greener, and they're like, why can't we have that? It's like, okay, you can't have that because I just burnt it to the ground. Okay, well, I'm looking over there. Why? But look at Hungary and Czechia and Slovakia. You can't have that because I'm burning them to the ground as well. It's like, and he's just trying to ruin the things that either hold Russia to account, or act as a temptation to his domestic population. But we need to be fighting all the time to make sure that we are holding on to democracy. It's so super important.
I heard recently an anecdote of a guy who was, it was General Hertlinger, who told a story where he was in East Berlin at the end of the GDR and all that, and he asked his counterpart from East Germany, what was the worst thing about being in this kind of autocratic system? And he said one of the worst things was every night in East Berlin, where it was dark and dank, and people kind of, they went home and they ate their, they kind of went through their meager evening kind of thing, but they could see on the other wall the lights of West Berlin, and they said, there's freedom over there. That's where people are free. And it was this kind of contrast. So I think there is something to this concern that Putin has, that if Ukraine, which, and I know many Ukrainians will get furious at me for saying this, are brethren, to the Russians, for better or worse, after, a shotgun wedding and centuries of living together, you're going to rub off on one another inevitably. But if the Ukrainians are able to create a functioning democracy, a lot of Russians are going to go, well, we're not that different from them, right? I mean, isn't that what everybody's been telling us? And if they're making this work, why can't we? And that's a threat to Putin. Now, how much of that is in his thinking, I don't know. Yeah, no, I don't. I think he is of the mind. As a KGB guy, he's like, I'll just turn the screws a little bit tighter. But I do think there is. I
don't think he believes democracy is real. I mean, and this is through conversations I've had.
Yes. Yeah. No,
his mindset, it's not real. It's not organic. It's a sham. It's not just hypocrisy. It's an absolute lie, just like the lies we tell, but we're more brazen with the lies, so somehow that's better. I don't think he believes it's even a thing, because he's never lived in a Western European democracy. He's never, unlike many of the sort of diplomats and others who form part of his system, who cynically understand that these things are real and choose the other path, the other way. I don't think he has any conception of how it all works, or how that level of trust comes about or exists or makes the world function. He sees a watch.
It's all a facade.
But has
It's
no
all a facade in his mind.
It's all facade.
Yeah, it's all a facade.
It's little guys in there turning the handles as far as he's concerned.
Exactly. And when push comes to shove, it is power, bold-faced power, manipulation of populations, manipulation. I mean, that's why he can't accept the idea that the Maidan was a grassroots movement, that it was a rising up from it. Of course, it was the CIA that manipulated it, because he can't conceive of these kind of the will of the people for these kind of ideals, because these ideals are false and fake and just as I keep saying, a hypocrisy. I think you're right. I don't think he can conceive of it.
And it gets
and they go against statism. They go against everything he stands for.
Mm-hmm.
This one for you, Jonathan, because what really puzzles me, there's a certain imperial chauvinism in there, as well as all the other stuff combined, and the KG paranoia. Not believing that people have agency and that there's such a thing as a leaderless movement. It's totally beyond his conception how that can exist. So therefore it doesn't. It's all CIA. But when you get extreme leftists and extreme rightists, they also tend towards this disbelief in agency. It's like, Yanukovych, Maidan. Yeah, of course, that you cannot have an organic revolution. That's got to be the CIA as well. So it's not just this is a Russian way of thinking. This way of being cynical can pollute our politics as well.
I think it kind of sits very comfortably with generations of people who have been sucked in by conspiracy theories as well. And you look at recently with Scott Horton, who's written this book Unprovoked. He was on Piers Morgan arguing against Anastasia Pereskova and arguing against General Wesley Clark.
Last week's episode, and I saw she was on Silicon Curtain as well. She's wonderful.
Yeah, she's absolutely great. And so you've got, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, these people who have been sucked in by the NATO expansionism, and it's all the fault. And it's almost, it is like a conspiracy theory. It's like America's gone around, and there are elements of this, like, and America has gone around the world, like, getting rid of democratically elected governments, and there is the element of a US imperialism that I think is legitimate. There is a legitimate criticism, but in terms of what's happened historically with Ukraine, that is not what has happened. Like, the US and the EU didn't come around and go, oh, we're just going to manipulate all these people to go out and protest. They were genuinely pissed off because Yanukovych had done the wrong thing and gone against what he had promised to do. And so, it's when Scott Horton's like making these proclamations on Piers Morgan, and Anastasia is like, hang on, I was there as a young woman protesting because of X, Y, and Z. You can't tell me that I was doing that on account of what John McCain was saying. Or no, I was pissed off with Yanukovych going, like, you can't tell me my reality. And you get these people who are just, it's no matter what the data, for somehow like an invading Russian force that is committing all sorts of atrocities can't be happening, and it must be the US's fault, or it must be the UN, it must be NATO's fault, or it must be the EU's fault. Get a grip.
Yeah, there's always the marionette, the behind the curtain who's running in this perception. And I was on Maidan as well, and I spoke about it. I mean, like, the little old ladies who came in from very far out with, gallon buckets of soup to feed the protesters on the Maidan, they weren't pro-CIA or anti-CIA. They just knew that this movement was important for them, and they believed in the movement that these people were fighting for. I mean, to say it was all machinations. And yes, you can make the argument that, oh, well, they were just manipulated. Maybe they didn't even know what they were. It doesn't matter. The sentiment was still the same. And the sentiment was, we don't want Yanukovych. We don't want to live under Moscow. This was a true grassroots movement and continues to this day. And also, not for nothing, and this is something that at some point the Russians are going to have to swallow. And also, the Votniks like Scott Horton or Mearsheimer, or God forbid that Stephen Cohen. I wish death on nobody, but oh boy, if Stephen Cohen was still around, whew, I used to have the worst arguments with him. We would go. I mean, I was respectful because he was this great professor, but he was very much an apologist for Russia for these kind of ideas. But I say that there was that the movement in the Maidan was grassroots, but aside from the grassroots perspective of it, I think at some point the Russians are going to have to recognize this, and the pro-Russian Votniks are going to have to accept this. We've crossed the Rubicon. There's been too much blood, even if it was started by a CIA coup in Newland and what have you. The hatred of the Russians in Ukraine right now is palpable. Yeah. I mean, you maybe you go down to Odessa, or you go out to, maybe like Kherson or something. You'll find the occasional, oh, life was better when we were in the USSR, but that is a minority. The great majority of Ukrainians, especially after all this blood, no, they're not. It's not. You don't need the CIA to foment anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine anymore.
Yeah, and even if Scott Horton was completely correct in it was the UN and the US what started the war, right? Which is his which I absolutely disagree with, because if anything, if you do think that they were involved at all, they're involved precisely because Russia was doing that, and some with a little green men, but that was eventually. But actually, previous to that, all of the Russian paid influence in Ukrainian politics. No one looks at them. People like Scott Horton didn't write books on what Russia was doing for the 10, 20 years before that, since 1991, trying to affect Ukrainian politics. It's absolutely one-sided. But even if you granted Scott Horton and John Mearsheimer, it still doesn't get you to justify invading a country. It doesn't do the job to say so. Therefore, it's okay because the UN, or sorry, because NATO and the US were X, Y, and Z over here. It now justifies a country invading another country and killing its people and flattening its cities and torturing and stealing children. What you live in a war reality.
He rails against the horrors of the American empire, but he doesn't have a problem whatsoever with the Russian empire.
And can I just say one thing as well, because I've said this to my and I'd be interested if you to know if you've seen this, as you were there, Phil. But the single greatest documentary I think I've ever seen is a Netflix documentary called Winter on Fire, and it is actually available for free on YouTube.
Fantastic.
They put it on YouTube as well, so if you don't have Netflix, you can check it out on YouTube. It is an absolutely incredibly well constructed documentary. It is beautiful. It's evocative.
You'll cry.
Tears. You will cry. You will cry. But you will actually cry, I think, joy at the end that people can stand up for that which is good and right. It's just absolutely incredible. Go and watch it if you haven't already watched it. And if you have watched it again.
And also during that time, and yes, absolutely, that documentary, but there's also, there's so much to what Maidan was and how that went down. And and perception of it and how it's manipulated, and how the Russians have their narrative that they try and spill all over the place by using people like Scott Horton. But there was a wonderful Ukrainian poetess who I got to know on Maidan in 2014, and she's still out there writing, but she's become more of a stay-at-home mother. But she wrote this wonderful poem which begins, "Мы никогда не будем братьями, ни по роду, ни по матери. We're never going to be brothers again. You've broken this contract. We're going one way, and I don't think Russians in general and Putin specifically can comprehend. And it is almost like a mental block that it's just something they can't, as the I hate to use this term because it predates X and Elon, but they can't grok it. It's just not in them to understand that the people of Ukraine. It's the old analogy, which is overused, I know, but I use it myself. It's when you're in a relationship and the first person who puts hands on the other one violently, you cross a line that can't be uncrossed. You ring a bell that can't be unrung. And Russians still think somehow down the road they're going to be buddies again, that they're going to reunify. And it's just, we're so past that.
I'm sorry, that divorce has happened. In you ain't. That is unrequited love. if you call invading another country love, but yeah, it ain't gonna happen. Jonathan, should we remind people about the truckage?
Yes. So very important campaign we're running here. This is to buy essential life-saving trucks. And as we saw a little bit earlier today, there's actual images of some of these very same trucks that have been fundraised here by the very same charity. These have been sort of armored. They've got protective steel plates put in the doors, compartments, and also put in the front as well, so that these vehicles are better protected against things like drones, IEDs, and all the rest. This not just saves sort of limbs, it saves Ukrainian lives, and these are the most precious thing. This is what Ukraine is fighting for, the lives of its people, not just territory and all these kind of things and assets and resources. Fundamentally, they're fighting for their people. The campaign's doing well. We're just about to reach the halfway point in terms of the target fundraising. Of course, we want to smash that. We want to exceed that. I certainly want to make sure that I reach my allocation of an entire truck. I hope that by Christmas Day that will be achieved. I think we're on course to do that. Jonathan is doing spectacularly well. He's already onto his third truck now. But of course, he can't drive 3 trucks. He can only drive 1. So there will be a convoy setting out in January to take this over to Lviv so that they can be reupholstered and the various sort of tests they go through to make sure they can cope with winter conditions on the Eastern Front and protect the Ukrainian service people who are going to be using them to transport, loads, munitions, supplies, medical supplies, and so on to the front. And of course, these vehicles come in vital, potentially to bring people who are wounded, etc., back from the front lines. Because of the actions of drones and so on, the attrition rate on these vehicles is horrendous. But of course, if you're wounded, every second counts. So having vehicles like these, robust vehicles that don't break down, is incredibly important. It gives people a fighting chance for life if they've been hit. And of course, for those driving the vehicles, it gives them protection if Russia does target their vehicles. So this is an incredibly important campaign to my mind.
Absolutely. And let's support, all of these guys. Let's get some love for Phil in there. So if you are wanting to donate today, think about throwing some in for Phil, Canty Luden as well. All just fantastic members of this community that seems to have developed around Ukraine. I mean, this has got to be there's so many firsts in history, aren't there? This is a first. Or is it the first war where you have seen fundraising for armed forces? I don't know. I'm sure someone mentioned something about the Second World War where things.
We had war bonds. We had war bonds, baby. We had girls in miniskirts and performances all around the country where they went and raised money from the civilians from war bonds. What is different this time, however, is that we as individuals can start these kind of projects, and I'm sure that's been done in the past as well.
Yeah.
But with the reach that we have now given to us because of the internet, and now I'm an old fogey and old dogs and new tricks and all that kind of stuff. So, and as you guys have mentioned, I tend to do a weekly show at the end of the week, but there's a lot of production that goes into that. Before I can produce it, but I am determined to step up my game because I think I've got my Sunday show. This Sunday show is all set up, so I can now divert, and I'll be putting out more content to raise more money. But it is of course, especially at this time of year, the season of giving. Of course, this is the time to do this. Let's hope that next year it'll be in peace. But right now we have Ukrainian lives to save, and an oppressive occupier and invader of a colonial master, an imperial power trying to re-exert its influence on its former colony, an abusive spouse that has raised its hand to the peaceful, more loving, more, what have you, member of the relationship who just simply wants to leave because it's an abusive relationship. So, anyhow, now is the time.
I mean, I think it's Russia.
Yeah.
I know Joseph Lindsay's got a good comparison. He calls Russia the school shooter of nations, which I think is a fairly evocative, nihilistic image. I tend to think of it as the boyfriend or the spurned potential boyfriend, gets turned down, who throws acid in the face so that no one else can.
If I can't have you, no one can.
That's what they're doing in places like Kherson, isn't it? Like, if I can't have Kherson, we're going to just completely render it unlivable. But yeah, sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah,
it's what they're doing all over, and that they'll continue to do that. That's the fear, that if we don't show strength, they'll continue their scorched earth where they can.
I had thought for a long time that maybe the Lavra, the Holy Lavra here in Kiev, would provide us at least some protection, because yes, I know that religion is actually on the wane in Russia, but it is still there. There is this story they tell themselves of the origin of Rus, and this is, between Saint Sophia's and the Lavra, this is their birthplace. And I was hoping that it would say this, but given what Vladimir Putin has said, in his recent large scale press, his annual big press conference thing. That we're going to have a test of whether or not the West can defend against hypersonic missiles. And I live in downtown Kiev, and that's where our studio here is, in downtown Kiev. So I must admit that it gives me pause for concern. But it's too important. It's too important. This resistance to what Moscow wants to do, and I don't know if they are going to get to a point where it doesn't matter anymore, and they're just going to again flatten everything. Because, as Jonathan, you say, if you throw the glass of acid in the face, because if I can't have you, no one can. So, do they destroy Kiev and the Lavra? I mean, Saint Sophia's,
this is something I call.
I mean, it's just
something I called the Putin paradox, and I did a video on this years back, which is the better the Ukraine do, annoyingly, the more likely it is Putin's going to do something mental, which is, you want Ukraine to win, but you don't want Putin to do something mental, right? So this is a paradox. Like these two things, like counter each other, and that's of course that's anti-escalation, Jake Sullivan, etc. But it is a threat that is fairly plausible.
And I don't necessarily think escalation management was wrong in the first months. I think that sort of measured approach, let's test things, see if this triggers, find out where the red lines are. That's pretty sensible grown-up statecraft. Where it falls apart is you test it, you realize the red line isn't really a red line, and then you self-deter. I mean, this is where I think it went from being a reasonable response to being an absolute failed response. And then the failure to understand the Russian mindset, which is, you know, if a gopnik is stealing your bag, they're not going to stop if you try to use words of persuasion. Only punching them face is going to work. And you speak to many Ukrainians, and it's the language of the street, but it's absolutely true. Only if you display strength to Russia will they back off. I suspect
all power
they
is
won't
binary.
be mental. Yes, power is binary. I don't think necessarily he will be mental unless he is actually threatened in Moscow and the armies are on, you know, the Moscow ring road. Everything else is contingent. Everything else is just you lose it, you win it, you push, you see what you can get through violence. So I think we've learned enough now to think that he's not insane. He just does not exist in the same framework of rationality and humanity that we do, but he's not clinically insane.
It was what was frustrating is like we'd like walk up and go, oh look, there's no red line here. It turns out that we imagined this red line and there was no red line. So quickly, where's the red paint? Quick, let's paint a red line. Ah, look, there's a red line. In fact, there's another red line. In fact, give me the whole paint pot. You're throwing red paint everywhere, and like, it turns out there are red lines anywhere. No, we've invented that. We painted those red lines, you dingbat.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is that actually what Putin's doing is just sitting back and eating a popcorn while we paint ourselves into a corner of red lines. And he's like, look at them. They feel they can't do anything because they think, you know, they've got this perception of what we're going to do. I was never going to do that. But now they've painted themselves all these red lines. Hilarious.
Well, and the Americans being the Americans, everything is seen through their prism. It's very myopic. So I do think that part of the whole red line argument and the escalation concerns was not solely about what Russia would do in response, but what that would mean domestically in the American political system. Because if there had been some sort of massive escalation by something that America had done, like say we had given them at the very beginning F-16s galore, and every Bradley fighting vehicle that we have mothballed, and you know, and just flooded the zone, and he had done something in, you know, not insane, but you know, like it had done something extreme. Let's put it that way. You know, by destroying what have you. That would have given political ammunition to Donald Trump. Now it turns out that Trump won anyhow. So hindsight being 2020, why, you know, that whole argument is faulty. But I do think that what was a contributing factor to that policy of non-escalation wasn't just about Russia and what Russia was going to do in response. It was what it was going to mean in the American political landscape, and I'm deeply saddened by that. I understand
and knock-on effect on oil prices.
Yeah,
I think oil prices being the big elephant in the room throughout. Don't do anything that's going to trigger world oil markets, whereas what we should be doing, and what Trump may even do inadvertently, is crash the price of oil. We see the Chinese economy demand going out of that as their property bubble burst. We could see the global demand for oil actually start to ease off. We could see various oil producers preemptively trying to please Donald Trump by lowering the price of oil. We could see America sort of drilling like there's no tomorrow. These things will wreck the Russian economy, because the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the rise and fall of Russian power, there actually is a strong correlation with the price of oil all the way through. So it's not all about weapons. Weapons are great. Before we sort of wrap this up, because then we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, we're going to remind everybody of the totals here and maybe queue up some of the topics for tomorrow, because one I really want to touch on, and this is endlessly infuriating, it's, as you say, and it really picks up what you're talking about, Phil. So Biden, extremely cautious, and I think they imposed a high degree of caution on Ukraine. They prevented Ukraine from hitting, Russian oil refineries during the election campaign. They really, I think, said, look, we're going to give you some stuff after the election, but you have to play ball here and you have to tone it all down and just take the blows, which is deeply immoral during the election period. I'm pretty sure that's something that happened because there's a clear correlation. And the minute the election's done, boom, Ukraine's off with storm shadows and whatever, hitting a whole variety of targets, literally, when the vote closed. Then they're lost. Then it's announced that Jake Sullivan is going to be charged with sending everything humanly possible to Ukraine in the period before the transition, or in this transition period before the new administration comes in. They're now just starting to make noises that, actually, that's not really going to happen, or it's physically impossible to do that. So there's all this money approved, and it won't be spent. This is an insult piled on an insult. It's moral. It's a sort of a degenerate kind of political morality piled on top of a hopeless, awful set of behaviours and decisions. So if it sounds I
I'm slightly disagree. I think it's a miscalculation. I think they thought they were going to win the election, and then they had their schedule laid out, and they lost the election, and then they're like, "Oh bugger!" And they put all their eggs in that basket, and now they have to spank all that money, and they don't have time to do it. I mean, which you can say is,
I don't think they even have the.
You can say that's deeply irresponsible.
They could do it if they wanted. They could get all this stuff on trailers. It could be in the system, but I don't. There's a lack of priority there, Jonathan. There's a lack of. Ukraine is not top of their list of priorities. If it was, they could do more.
I somewhat disagree. So they have spent. I think they're on track. They will have spent all the USAI, which is they're ordering from US military industrial complex entities. What they're struggling is the presidential drawdown authority, and my guess, and because it's very easy to say, oh, they just cocked up, it was stupid. I don't think there are stupid people in DOD. I think they kind of they've got schedules and ideas and they know what they're doing. But in order to give Ukraine all that amount of stuff, and for it to be the right stuff, right, you could spend that PDA now. They could give them 2,000 Abrams tanks, and that would be spending all that, but they don't need 2,000 Abrams tanks. There are certain things that they need, and the American stockpiles have probably run fairly empty of some of those key things. And so they've ramped up the military industrial complex to be building artillery ammunition and HIMARS rockets at the scale they need. But in order to get that through from presidential drawdown authority, you need to take that from the stocks and then do USA or however to backfill those stocks. And I think that while you probably could make up the remainder of that money of stuff that the US has, it's not the stuff that Ukraine definitely needs. I think that you're likely to see some Bradleys come along soon. I think that's one of the biggest things that they probably need. And I think
it's already happening under the wire.
Yes.
If I could just quickly interject, because I know we want to wrap this up, but I do have a couple of points and a perspective that I can provide. I was an eyewitness to the buildup of U.S. armed forces in Kuwait in the run-up to Iraq. I was in the desert out in Kuwait, and I watched that logistical effort, and it was freaking enormous. It did take months, but it did happen, and I think JF, you're right. If they wanted to get this stuff over here, they could. Now, having said that, I've spoken to a contact of mine, a guy I know who is a former naval commander who worked in logistics, because it is, at the end of the day, when you're talking about heavy stuff like tanks and Bradleys, you're putting those on ships. Ammunition, you can put on planes. And I think that's why they've been focusing on things like Patriot missiles, to replenish that stockpile, HIMARS, and 115 millimeter shells for their artillery system, because you can put that on a plane, get it over here real quick, and Trump can't stop it. When you talk about larger systems like tanks and armored fighting vehicles, and particularly Bradleys and Humvees, and also more M777 artillery units, or even M113, those old Vietnam style armored personnel carriers. But what you're talking about is big big items like that you can't just accept in limited supplies, put onto a plane and fly over. You got to organize it at one port, load it onto a ship, ship it over here, get it off at Gdansk or wherever you depart. And then once it's here in Europe, the argument that was made by this former naval officer who's far more knowledgeable about this stuff, once it's over here, the heavy stuff, it's a little bit because inertia starts to take over. And even to the point of like when they depart, whatever American port they depart from, that's going to be harder for Trump to pull back. So we might see a lot of Bradleys suddenly showing up in Gdansk, closer towards the transition. We will have to see, of course, but my bet is the reason they fixated on ammunition, shells, and missiles and what have you is because you can put that on a plane, get it over here quickly. We are yet to see the harder stuff because that is a more difficult process logistically, but it's also a process once it starts, it's harder for him to stop. So that's, I think, where we stand with, but it's never going to be enough. And I agree with you, Jonathan. I don't think that their statements that we don't have time now to get out the whole 5.6 over here. If they wanted to, they really could. It's not good. All the more reason why we should do this ourselves. So donate.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just do, before we properly wrap up, there's just a few bits to do with that. The Andrew Perpetua, who's in a live chat. Thanks, Andrew. Good to have you on board. We have so much power over fundraising. I don't think people even understand how much power we have. It's incredible, actually. We've some of my team and myself have fundraised for satellite imagery for Andrew Perpetua and his team. So there you've got the ability for an open source intelligence resource like Tochny and Andrew Perpetua and his team to do the work they need to do to get the data they need. But then, like, you're wondering, I wonder who uses a lot of this data, because I'm looking at like international intelligence agencies thinking, well, where are they getting their stats from? They don't have clipboards. They don't have, walking around the trench lines and counting up blown up stuff. So, I think open source intelligence has a lot of importance in informing us worldwide about what's going on, including the intelligence services. And we know because Commission, when he was the strategic industries minister, posted data from Andrew Perpetua and the Tochny team, who have been looking at drone strikes and the numbers of drone strikes that they've caught on their surveying of social media and blah, blah, blah. And they got the data sets for, Ukrainian versus Russian and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you've got then a minister of the country involved in the war quoting open source intelligence data that is underwritten by fundraising for satellite imagery, so on and so forth. The point is that we are playing as a general public who are literally invested in this war. We are playing a more important part than maybe we understand in terms of how, and different from, Phil was talking about previous fundraising examples, like in times gone past, but now we're at a point where we can literally buy drones ourselves. Like we can decide on what weapon we are going to provide for Ukraine in a way that was never the case before. So we are changing the way that war is being carried out. There's no doubt about that. There's an evolution of how fundraising has taken place. Sorry, I just saw just a few thanks, if I may, before I guess you guys will want to close up. Richard Bennett, thank you so much. 580p Geopolitics memberships are really kind of you. Dunk on You 23 says, working but listening, please care about the great work you all do. It's vital. Really appreciate your support. Johnny Nedregard, hello community, Slava Ukraini, and gifting a membership as well. And a few more. Aussie T with some membership gifts. That's really kind of you. Ozzy, and Susan Melendi as well with some membership gifts. And just a couple of comments to finish off from my side of things. Andrew Perpetua again, democracy. This is going back to our democracy conversation. Democracy is failing because we spent generations electing politicians who care more about getting elected than doing their job. Simple as. I can't say how important that point is. People are not interested in governing; they're interested in just getting into power. Once they get into power, and I think we're seeing this at the moment. And I don't want to pick on America again, but I think that you're like, if you're starting to employ people who are known as like a TV doctor to fulfill a position in your government, and someone who's in charge of worldwide wrestling to be your education minister, you're not freaking interested in governing. Like they're fundamentally problematic.
Go watch the 1972 Robert Redford film, The Candidate.
Okay, good hint there as well.
It's all about getting elected. It's all about getting elected. It's not about governing.
And when they fail, they don't understand the damage they deal. You have to serve your people at some point, even if your funders get sad. And that's the point. Like, it seems to be this perpetuation of I'm taking money in. I've got to appease the people who have given me that money. And it's nothing to do with the people who actually voted me in. It's to do with this perpetuation of money and appeasing them, money and appeasing my fundraisers. And when you've got lawmakers, again, in the US, like House of Representatives, when you are campaigning to be elected every 2 years, your entire life is a perpetual campaign fundraising cycle. You're just like fundraising, and then it's quid pro quo. As soon as you're getting that money, if you're getting those from corporate donors, you have to appease those corporate donors, etc., etc. And it's a problem that we need to solve worldwide, not just America. Anyway, that's the end of my rant. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for fundraising.
We're almost done. You might have seen me giggling there. That wasn't giggling at what Jonathan was saying. It's just my Twitter feed popped up with a Ukrainian song and dance sketch called Ivan, Why You Running Away? And all the backing singers are dressed in binoculars. It's in extremely poor taste, but
the women, it's in extremely poor taste, but it's also kind of funny. They're all in different traditional clothing and all the rest of it, and dancing and macabre, but a little bit of gallows humor.
We'll share that tomorrow. We are back on tomorrow. Tomorrow's 3:00. We hope to get the fundraisers well past the halfway mark on the overall bucket, and I hope to, get the individual campaign much closer to that halfway mark as well. So we'll join.
We didn't get Georgie, did we, Jonathan?
Georgie didn't come on today. I think from the messages, Georgie it's better for him to come on tomorrow. So we've got Dick Dawson and hopefully Georgie Ivanovs as well. So fingers crossed.
Well, I've got all my logistics out of the way for this week's episode of On the Edge for the Sunday premiere. So it's now just a matter of sitting down in our studio and filming it, which of course leaves me frees me up to pay a little bit more attention. But this old dog is learning some new tricks, so do bear with me. But I'm all for this effort, and let's keep it going.
Fantastic.
And gentlemen, I'm at your disposal.
Later. Yeah.
Sorry.
We will definitely call upon you. No question.
I'm at your disposal.
Have you on this. We'll do more of these. And for people who haven't had
all you need to do is ask.
There's more coming later. So on the IWI channel, we're talking to John Foreman. That'll be going up live tomorrow. And the video I recorded early today is with Sir John Shirreff, former deputy commander of NATO Forces Europe. He's come out with a very stark message, is that Britain needs to rearm for a potential war with Russia. So that episode is coming up in about 2 hours on Silicon Curtain.
Wow, it is, when you hear like Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, say these sorts of things, when you hear our own military people, retired and in fact in position, and that includes reports from Poland, reports from Estonia, Lithuania, saying, we need to be prepared for a Russian invasion in 3 to 6 years, then you're thinking, okay, interesting, we might need to be a little bit more worried.
And the fact that they just had a huddle in Rutte's house that did not include the Yanks, or at least no high-level representation. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Always a pleasure, guys.
Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure as ever to chat with you guys. It was another wide-ranging conversation that I think was, you know, not the usual conversational topics, maybe, but that gives the broad spectrum of what we can talk about, and I think that's great. It gives everyone something else to think about. Thank you, everyone, and I guess as per normal, Jonathan and Phil, the last thing to say should be Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava.
Heroyam Slava.
Nice one. Stay on the line, guys. Take care, everybody. Take care, all the teams, and keep plugging away at those campaign links to get these trucks to the people who need them most.